Hi, my name is Scott Brown and I am the saxophone instructor at the Decatur Fine Arts Academy, and I'm also a private lesson instructor in the Atlanta area. I'm really excited to talk to you today about the GMEA Tenor Saxophone Etudes. As a former All-State member myself, it brings me a lot of joy to be able to provide some thoughts towards these etudes. The first thing to consider with the Lyrical middle school etude is rhythm. There's a lot of triplet rhythms and there's a lot of dotted eighth plus 16th note rhythms in this etude. These two rhythms can very often sound similar, if not the same, if not paid enough attention to. The way to accurately make sure that these rhythms are distinct from one another is to practice away from the instrument. And so oftentimes I will practice by counting and clapping and making sure that the right number of notes are placed evenly in one beat. So oftentimes I'll practice this with the metronome or just by clapping and counting, just 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Or in the case of the 16th notes, 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4. By doing this, you're going to be able to come back to the instrument without the barrier of having to play the instrument. It's a lot easier to discern off of the horn the difference between these two rhythms, as opposed to doing this on the instrument. Once you can accurately make the distinction between the triplet rhythms and the dotted eighth plus 16th note rhythms, I would recommend thinking about where you're going to subdivide in advance. So as early as measure 1, we may have a half note as our first rhythm, but we have triplets as early as beat 3. And so throughout the entirety of that measure, and the half note particularly, I'm thinking about the triplets in my mind before I even play those triplets. And that way we can hear that distinction between triplets and 16th notes when they do arise. And oftentimes I find that the rhythm won't surprise me, and thus it won't surprise the audience in the same capacity. There's a couple things that I'd like you to consider with this technical etude. The first of which is making sure we're making an informed decision on which B-flat fingerings we're using. As we know, there's two different B-flat fingerings that I can use. There is the side B-flat and there is the bis B-flat. Now, you can use either one in your F major scale, and whichever one you're using there is probably what I would recommend you use whenever there's any passages here that resemble your F major scale. For instance, in measure 11, that basically is your F major scale, and so whichever B-flat fingering you use in the normal scale is what I would use there. However, for passages that aren't exactly scalar, I would use this general rule of thumb to make that decision. For scalar motion, I would generally use my side B-flat, and if there's any sort of leaps, I would use my bis B-flat fingering. Of course, that's a rule of thumb, and there's certain circumstances that I would maybe break that rule, but for the most part, I will generally stick to that. Ultimately, I recommend you try both fingerings every time there is a B flat. And you might come to find that you'll be surprised with which one is easier to use. So make sure that you experiment with your B flat fingerings throughout this etude. This etude offers a challenge of finding places to breathe. And so as you are going through this, I would mark in any places that you know you're going to breathe. And if you're unsure, I would try a couple different things out. We can always breathe whenever there's a rest, of course. We can sometimes cut off longer notes. For instance, in measure 7, perhaps you could breathe after the quarter note, and it may not be perceptible so long as everything is done in time. Wherever you're breathing, making sure it makes musical sense is important, but also making sure that you have enough air in your tank to get to the next breath is important. So try taking breaths in different places that make sense to you, and mark those breaths in, and that will make you have to think less of where you're breathing in the moment, and that will allow you to concentrate on something different. My last point with this etude is making sure that you play it lyrically, actually. Albeit this is a technical etude, that really only means that the tempo will be a little bit quicker and there's going to be more technical challenges. If you play this like a robot, it may not sound amazing. If you're still thinking of musical ideas and trying to play long, beautiful lines, then that can only enhance your performance of this etude. The lyrical etude for the concert band this year is a little bit shorter, and so that is a good thing in that we have less music to prepare. However, it does mean that we have to prepare at a very high level. So making sure that we check in with intonation is going to be critical here. I would recommend playing with a tuning drone playing in the background and making sure that you're checking all the pitches with the drone to make sure that you're playing in tune. For instance, for the first 2 measures of this piece, I would recommend putting a tuning drone on a concert C and just playing through and stopping if you hear something that sounds a little bit suspect. What I discovered when I was preparing this etude was that my A and my high D were both tending to be a little bit sharp. And so the solution I had for that was actually putting down my middle finger on my right hand. And that would bring the pitch down a little bit, and it would also prepare us for the F sharp and the middle of beat 3. Thinking of longer lines within the music is going to allow the performer to play more musically. I know we have this long line of 16th notes that goes in measure 3 and 4, and as we see 16th notes, it can oftentimes be the instinct to rush through or feel a little bit anxious. I encourage you to relax and just make sure you're still feeling the 8th note subdivision and the dotted quarter note subdivision. This way we won't rush or drag, and it'll allow us to aim our air for critical notes. For example, one might be the tenuto D sharp in measure 4. This etude starts off with quite the bang, with a bit of a difficult measure right at the beginning. This first measure has 2 composite lines, or 2 lines that add up to a composite idea happening simultaneously, and that's a little bit challenging in and of itself. And what I have found in particular is response in both lines can be difficult to achieve. And so I found that one line was more responsive than the other, and so I focused on making sure that the more difficult line to speak, which for me was the lower line with those repeated low Gs, I focused my attention there, making sure I was getting the proper response, and then the other line would just happen as a result. So make sure you push your air and you're using the lightest articulation you can. Further on the idea of articulation, there's a lot of different articulation patterns within this etude, and so I would highly recommend taking them out of the context of the etude and practicing in something familiar. I would recommend practicing them in scales. So in measure 2, we have the 1 articulated note plus 3 slurred notes, and I would practice that idea within a major scale that you're comfortable with. And as that articulation pattern happens again in measure 4 and again in measure 7, you're not only practicing one measure, you're practicing multiple. My last little tidbit of advice is learning the A melodic minor scale for this etude. A lot of this etude is in A minor, and specifically utilizes the A melodic minor scale. Thus, practicing the scale outside of the etude is a great idea because we don't have to worry about the context of articulation or any other situational things within this etude. Our A melodic minor scale can be derived from our C major scale, and so it shouldn't be entirely foreign. And so I think it's worth learning to make sure you feel more comfortable when you're playing in this etude. The first challenge that might visually come up when you're looking at this etude for the first time is some of these really large leaps. In measure 2, where we have leaps of almost 2 octaves, it's really, really important to make sure that we're playing smooth intervals, as this is a really slow lyrical etude. One idea to help hear it better, which in turn will help you play it better, is by actually bringing all of this into the span of 1 octave. So playing measure 2 without the octave key at all is going to help you hear it a little bit differently, and thus it'll help smooth out the intervals. Another tip with these intervals is just practicing individual intervals that may be problematic for you. So it may be the low E up to the high B, maybe whatever. Just practicing it going from the low note to the high note, and also practicing it from the high note back to the low note is a great way of making sure you understand the acoustics of the instrument and what you may have to do in that specific spot. A quick tip, in measure 3, we have the A sharp, but it's really difficult to use the side A sharp fingering in that spot since we already have our high E key down, and sliding onto the bis key may be inconsistent. So I would actually use your 1+1 or 1+2 A sharp fingering there. As we approach the end of this etude, our challenges shift a little bit. We have a lot less activity, and thus it's harder to maintain pulse. It's important to maintain good time as we're playing through this etude, as these rhythms are very precise. And so I would recommend playing what I call metronome games. Oftentimes when we practice, we try playing with the metronome on every beat, and so with the beat given at the 8th note level and at 72 BPM, perhaps trying with less information, or trying to play it at quarter note equals 36, so that's the same tempo, but you're getting half as many beats, it forces you to develop better internal pulse. In tandem with the time issues that we may encounter, we have to deal with these trills plus their grace notes and still do that in time, which is a bit of a challenge for sure. I would recommend taking these trill plus grace note gestures apart and just adding one element at a time. So start with just a half note, no trill or grace notes. Then maybe add the trill. Then take the trill away and add the grace notes in their stead. Once you can do all these different things and maintain a solid tempo, I would put it all together and make sure that time is solid. That exist within the symphonic band technical etude are similar to the challenges presented in the concert band technical etude. So I would highly recommend checking out that part of the video. But to reiterate some of the points from that part, we have articulation challenges that exist within this etude. Specifically, in measure 3, we have a tongue 1, slur 2, tongue 1 pattern. And so I would recommend trying that in a scale. Trying different patterns with articulation and scales is oftentimes the right place to experiment with that, as scales are comfortable and we already know the finger pattern and we don't have to worry about that. At the same time, we have to think about this composite line between the slurred notes and the articulated notes, and I'll find oftentimes that focusing on one as opposed to the other is going to help me perform it with more consistency. In measure 2 of this etude, we have the opportunity to use our alternate F-sharp fingering. Now, we don't use this frequently, however, I would recommend using it as it's a bit more consistent than flipping between your F natural and F sharp. Whenever possible, avoiding flipping is going to be for the best, as it allows for a bit easier response. There's a moment between the flip where both fingers are up, and sometimes we get an unwanted sound. And so have control and use the alternate F-sharp fingering in that spot. Thank you for checking out the video today. I hope my performances and tips were useful for you, and best of luck to all of you in your all-state audition endeavors.